Great, so we're gonna go ahead and kick things off. Today's webinar is covering some common themes from the first 2 months of technical assistance that the Joint Office has been providing to states and other stakeholders as you all work on your National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program state plans. So I'm Steve Lomley. I'm the Communications and Stakeholder Engagement Lead for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. And I'm joined today by Joanna Levine, Lisa Myers, Mike Scarpino, and Diane Turchetta. Joanna, Lisa, and I all come from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, but we are on detail to the Joint Office. Mike comes from Department of Transportation's Volpe Center, and he is on detail to the Joint Office. And then we've got Diane Turchetta as well from the Federal Highways Administration, also on detail to the Joint Office. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. First of all, we want to make sure that you're aware of important dates that we've got coming up here in the year with respect to the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program and other initiatives from the Joint Office. We want to remind you, of course, how to access technical assistance resources that are offered by the Joint Office, and then touch on this idea of a big tent. So the Joint Office has been working closely with many stakeholders, recognizing the years and years of experience that many folks have spent working to build a national network for electric vehicle charging and enable an electrified transportation system. So we'll cover that. And then some of the common themes that we've heard over the last 2 months. So all of us on the webinar today have been participating in one-on-one calls with states as you all develop your NEVI state plans. And so we want to touch on some of the common themes that have come up in those calls, share some information on the alternative fuel corridors versus the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program requirements and what that looks like, talk about how states have approached their NEVI state plans, as well as some of the common exception themes that have come up. At the end, we'll cover a few open items that we are still working on, and then touch on a few things that are coming up here shortly. Next slide, please. So in terms of important dates, you probably all saw that on February 10th, we issued the NEVI program guidance and state plan template. We also issued a request for round 6 alternative fuel corridor nominations. So those were issued. Every state we've talked to is deep into the state planning process and also thinking about designating additional electric vehicle corridors. And then coming up here in just a few days, around mid-May, we'll have the 180-day minimum standards and requirements associated with the NEVI formula program. And also specifically on May 13th, the requests for round 6 nominations are due. State plans are due on August 1st, and then those state plans will be approved by Federal Highways by September 30th. The Joint Office will be reviewing all state plans and making recommendations to the Federal Highways Administration on approval of those state plans. And then 2 other things that are to be determined, but no later than 1 year after bill enactment, which will be November 2022. We'll have the discretionary notice of funding opportunities. So that's $2.5 billion for corridor and community charging grants. And then also 10% for the NEVI set-aside program. And then also later this year, we'll have freight, medium duty, heavy duty electric vehicle corridor designations and a request for nominations for those. Next slide, please. So I wanted to remind you all that we do have technical assistance available through the Joint Office. So we've had one-on-one conversations with states and many other stakeholders. And you can reach us anytime via email. You can reach us via the contact form on driveelectric.gov. And we actually have a phone number too, so you can call and submit questions that way. All of these requests that we receive go to our entire technical assistance team, and they're managed through an inquiry system so that we can ensure we get back to you in a timely manner. Given that we get so many requests and we've got a big team, we assign things using that done service to make sure that we get back to all of you. So again, please do reach out to us anytime. The best way to reach us is via the contact form or that email address that you see on the screen now. We've gotten many inquiries and have established great relationships with many of you. So keep the questions coming. And with that, I want to turn it over to Mike Scarpino. Next slide, please.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, everyone. Hopefully, if you're in Hawaii and it's 6:30, you've got a nice cup of coffee. So as Steve mentioned, we've been very busy the last couple of months with our state one-on-one meetings. We found that these are a very important way to connect with the states. We spend a lot of time on these meetings. In most of these, the majority of the time we spend is addressing questions that the states have prepared ahead of time that they've sent to us. Most of it does focus on the NEVI formula program, but there's also many discussions that we have around the round 6 alt fuel corridor nominations and what might be the strategies for submitting something under this round. Definitely providing general assistance with plans and clarifications while we can on the program guidance that was issued back in February, and some of the questions that are asked have a response that, well, we'll have to wait till the 180-day minimum standards and requirements are issued, because we think that those will take care of those questions. As you can see on the map and over on the left-hand side, we've actually met with 44, we've had 44 meetings, so that's 43 states plus the District of Columbia. There's 7 left that we haven't met with. I think the ones highlighted in yellow are scheduled. So we have Colorado, Washington, and Hawaii scheduled. Still looking to get our first meeting on the board with North Dakota, Iowa, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Next slide, please. So Steve described the approach of building the big tent. We certainly do not have any illusions that we are driving the bus here. We are just helping facilitate many efforts that are ongoing. And a lot of what we are doing with NEVI is leveraging other programs, other past programs, and other organizations that have been very active in this space for many years. Back on March 1st, a MOU was signed between AASHTO and NASIO, which recognized the role that state energy offices and state DOTs will play, working together and coordinating efforts to launch the NEVI program. Another thing that we've done is we've been making sure to include the Federal Highway Division offices, in all of our state meetings. They have historically been, a partner with the state DOTs, and with NEVI, this will be nothing different. Nothing different will be, the focus on electric vehicle charging that, hasn't historically been in the division office wheelhouse. So it's been very important to include them in the conversations, let them hear the questions and the issues. And there's many issues that come up in our state one-on-one meetings that really the division offices and Federal Highway headquarters are really the appropriate people to answer. A sources sought request was issued out of NREL, and they're looking to hire or actually create a list of organizations that will be able to assist the joint office with our mission. This is due on Friday, May 6th, so it's coming right up this Friday. But they're looking to identify organizations with experience in planning for charging deployment, siting, equipment, vehicle selection acquisition, utility interconnection, grid impact. So a lot of the subjects that we'll be involved in with the joint office, this would be an opportunity to throw your hat in the ring to potentially be part of, if there is funding for some specific activities, this will narrow down the field and organizations could be selected from that. Also working very closely with the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Cities program, which, for 25 plus years has really been the major program advancing alternative fuel deployment activities across the country. And we see Clean Cities playing an important role in our work. Next, please. So kind of breaking things down here into the major themes we've heard. I'm going to touch just a little on looking at the alt fuel corridor designations on the next slide. And then Joanna will be looking at some of the mapping strategies. Lisa will then be talking about the state plan and the exception scenarios. The next one, please. So a lot of questions come up during the one-on-one meetings, just trying to get, everyone's arms around what is the intersection between the corridor designations and NEVI. You know, the bill bipartisan infrastructure language, you know, ties the NEVI funding, particularly in this first phase, to having to be on designated corridors. So just as a quick reminder, I won't go through all of the, you know, the details here, but you know, the states that have been designating corridors for the last 5 years through the first 5 rounds have corridors that are designated right now as either pending or ready. And really the goal is to take any stations that are along those corridors or site new ones that will, you know, fill gaps or extend corridors to get to the fully built out criteria. So, you know, you can see that the ready criteria, particularly for electric, has changed over the years. Level 2 was allowed originally, and then there was CCS and CHAdeMO, and you can see what the round 6 requirements are now. We pulled in the 5-mile requirement to 1 mile or less, and now there's new requirements for numbers of ports and power levels. But really the focus, you know, for the states needs to be looking at corridors, be it pending or ready, and getting to fully built out, which is really the goal of using the immediate NEVI funds and then reaching fully built out if you have any funding remaining that you could apply anywhere across the state. Next slide, please. And that's it for me. So I'm going to pass this over to Joanna for the next few slides.
Thanks, Mike. So for those of you who've worked with me or talked with me on any of the state calls, you know that I get super excited when we can talk about maps. And so I think one of the things that helps with the clarification between the NEVI corridors and the alternative fuel corridors that Mike was just discussing in his chart is actually seeing some examples. And so some of these are examples that we have had conversations with states. Some of them are examples that we have put together in anticipation of having some conversations with states. So I just want to walk through and talk about how these play out in the real world. So what we have here is a map of Colorado. You can see that Colorado has pending corridors that are the dashed yellow lines. They have ready corridors. Those are the green lines. And then this map is actually coming from a tool that we have available on the AFDC from the afdc.energy.gov/corridors page. And we have this ability to show what we call potential electric corridors. And so that's a pretty basic analysis that we do where we draw a bubble around every station that's a 25-mile buffer. So it stretches 50 miles from station to the end of the bubble and from station to the end of the bubble as the crow flies. So it's not actual driving directions. But what that gives you as an example right here that you can see on I-70 that's just west of Denver, you know, we've got a station here that's just west of Denver, and then it stretches out to another corridor that's designated, but it doesn't quite touch this next station that meets the NEVI criteria on I-70. And yet you can see that that is a designated ready corridor. So we're not changing that alternative fuel corridor designation from ready to pending as a result of this. You know, there are stations that did make this in earlier rounds a ready corridor, but we do recognize that in order to get to that next stage of fully built out, that there's either going to need to be a station that's going to need to be upgraded here, or there's going to be a new station that needs to go into place in order to be able to complete that corridor so that the 61-mile stretch is bridged by NEVI stations that meet NEVI requirements. Similarly, you can see that there's another opportunity here where you're heading on I-76, you're heading sort of northeast out of Denver. There is a station here that, again, in previous rounds, we allowed for a 5-mile driving distance from the roadway. And now this station is 3.8 miles away. And so one of the things that, you know, looking at as you're looking towards a NEVI compliant corridor is, you know, when you zoom into this 3.8 mile station is really interesting because you're driving along the highway for quite a bit of that. And then you're cutting in to actually enter the entrance on the highway. So thinking about from a state perspective, is that the experience you want to be able to have the drivers to have? Is that a station that you want to be able to use as your NEVI compliant station as you're looking towards fully built out? Or is there another station that you want to upgrade? So looking into these details has been something that we've been doing with states we've been talking to states about, we've been trying to explain the differences between a fully built out corridor, alternative fuel corridor that's pending, and alternative fuel corridor that's ready. How have these things changed over time? So one of the things that I wanted to show you all as sort of a preview of a tool that we have coming is the ability to actually calculate segments. So we have the ability to calculate segments, which we're calling a segment, the distance from a station to a station, and be able to say like, this segment actually meets the NEVI criteria, right? So this is 2 stations that are less than 50 miles apart via driving directions. It's no longer the buffers, so that we can see where we're getting to the point where we're actually starting to build out some contiguous corridors between stations. But we're also trying to see where those segments do not actually always equal a corridor. Because in the past, a corridor has always been, for those of you who've been involved in the designation process, right? A corridor has been, I am designating I-25 from this exit to this exit, and it's a single roadway. And we're saying that we know that we have enough infrastructure from this segment, from this exit to this exit, to make a driver able to drive all along I-25, and it's just I-25. And in the course of our analysis, where we were trying to put together these maps, where we're trying to predict where we actually have corridors that are ready corridors and that also meet the NEVI requirements, and in some amazing conversations that we had with some states, particularly Kentucky, we realized that the way we drive and the way we calculate corridors is different, right? I mean, you don't just drive on I-25, you don't just drive on I-70. That doesn't make an actual network. That just makes a corridor. And so one of the things we're trying to do is to provide data to the state so that we can do things like this. We can show these segments, but we can also provide that with a clarity of a segment is not a corridor. And we, as the joint office, are trying to understand the nuances and the difference between those two, so that, you know, you can drive and you can take this little I-7 or I-270 stretch right here, which has no stations on it, right? It's a little segment. There's no stations on it. Well, how do we make that an actual ready corridor? How do we actually make that so that it's fully built out? What does that mean? And so part of the reason why we don't accept any requirements for fully built out in this first year is because there's a lot of tricky nuances like this that we're trying to learn and we're trying to understand. And we're so appreciative of the conversations we have with the states as we're walking through all of these complicated roadways and these complicated travel patterns to understand how do we actually do this. So we do want to make these segments available to the states, but like I said, we want to make the segments available with the understanding of a segment is not a corridor, and we're trying to figure out how we both connect the dots and make full road segments within an actual like designated highway. So within I-25 or within I-70. So this is just reiterating some of what I just said on a different map. So the map that I showed you before was as of the end of March. And this is a map that we ran this weekend that is as of last weekend. And so we ran our analysis again to see where these segments are. And all of a sudden there were new segments. There were, 3 new segments. There were stations that showed up that weren't there before. And so we started digging into this. And another complicating factor, as if all of this wasn't complicated enough, is that stations are changing and stations are being upgraded and stations are being installed while we're all trying to put these plans together and we're all trying to do the work. And that's what we want, right? We want this to change over time. We want new stations to go in. And so the other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out ways that we can help you all stay on top of this, right? So to understand, I swear there was a station there, Joanna, that met the requirements yesterday and it's not there today. What's happened? Well, what's happened is we update the station locator every night and that station may be offline. We get that data automatically from the networks, and it just may be that it's down for maintenance. It may be that there's been a blip in their network and it's just not there. And so one of the things that we have requested funding for is to be able to expose some of the data that we have that actually allows you to go back in time so that you could say, I swear that station was there yesterday, and you can click back a few days and it will show up and you can be like, okay, that station was there. It's good. I can move forward. But understanding how do we deal with these like time changes as we're looking towards fully built out designation is another challenge we're going to have to come up with. And again, segments are not corridors. We're trying to figure out how do we understand how we calculate a segment and how we translate that to a corridor designation. So more coming soon, but again, in the spirit of candor, in the spirit of being open and honest with each other between the joint office and the states. Like, we want to be able to talk through these and say, thank you for bringing us these challenges. Thank you for bringing this to us. If all of our roadways were like this one right here on I-70, like that would be easy, but it's not, right? We have lots of complicated circular highways, roadways, small connection highways that we need to figure out how we're going to do all of that. And we're going to work on it, and we're going to work on it together. Another thing that I want to bring out is you're calculating segments. So we have another tool that actually, beyond the tool that I showed you that's coming soon, it actually allows you to calculate segments yourself, right? So you can click on a beginning station, click on an ending station, and you can see the length of that segment. You can see what the driving distance actually is from the station to an interstate highway. Right now, it just works for interstate highways. But you'll notice some really funky nuances with this as well. So this is a path, a segment that's in Florida. It's starting in Davenport, Florida, and it's moving to Tampa, Florida. You can see it's 57 miles. And unfortunately, the station in Tampa is 1.7 miles away from the interstate. So it doesn't meet the NEVI requirements unless you measure it the other direction. And if you measure it the other direction and you start at Tampa and you end in Davenport, all of a sudden Tampa is fine and now Davenport isn't fine. And that is the nature of travel, right? That's how this all works. So it leads to nuanced questions like, should Florida use east-west directions or west-east distance calculations, or should they use both? Is there a third NEVI station needed here in order to make this so that it's 58 miles? Well, this is a segment, it's not a corridor. So the question is like, how do we actually measure that? How are we going to go through and how are we going to designate those as a joint office? There's also 5 stations along this route. Should Florida be updating one of those stations so that it meets NEVI requirements? All good questions, all things we've gotten from states, all things we're hoping that we can help you together work out what the best way to do this is. I mean, we've had discussions, you know, for this particular example, we would say that this is under a mile from the highway, because it is under a mile from the highway, given either driving direction. That's fine. We just don't want you to do these calculations and worry and be like, oh no, like this is a problem. Again, keeping the spirit of the law, keeping the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish in mind as we're going through and doing these calculations is what we really want folks to do from the beginning. Another question we get all the time is, should I designate a new electric corridor? Why would I designate a new electric corridor? What's the strategy around designating these new corridors? We had an awesome conversation with Michigan last week, and they were saying, oh yeah, we've got a new corridor that we're going to designate. You know, we've got this roadway that's heading out of Detroit and it heads up into Canada, and we definitely want to designate that. And I started playing around with our measurement tool, and I was like, well, yeah, of course you would designate this. Like, this is good, right? This is a roadway that's going to take you from Roseville, Michigan into Sarnia, Ontario, and it's 50 miles. Like, it meets the requirements. The Sarnia one is 5.2 miles away from the interstate because that's Canada. Highways aren't part of our interstate calculations. So that's one of the reasons why we say, yes, for sure, designate a highway that isn't designated already, if it already meets the criteria. If it's a really important roadway to you and it's very important to your state to be able to travel on that highway using electric charging, designate it, right? That is, you're able to spend money on the NEVI funds on designated corridors sooner than you're able to spend funds on non-designated corridors. So the types of conversations we've been having and things that you should be thinking about. Finally, just to wrap up my segment, this is a map of all of the rounds 1 through 5 corridors. And you can see there's all sorts of dead ends at state borders and little floaty highways in the middle of states. And so one of the things the Joint Office is really going to be doing over this 5 years is looking at this national map and saying, do we have a network? Do we have regions that are connected? How can we help states designate roadways so that we actually can travel contiguous all the way across the country on these roadways? What can we do to help? And so all of the questions we're getting around, where do we need more corridors? Are there places where we have too many corridors? How do we work with that? What do we do with the dead ends at state borders? Are all questions we're excited to get. We're hoping to help you guys out on. We're trying to think about, and that's going to be how we move forward for the next 5 years. So with that, I'm going to leave you with one more map, but let Lisa present this. Lisa?
Thanks, Joanna. Hi, everybody. So we've had a lot of great meetings with a lot of you over the last couple months. And so I know we've talked about a lot of these things, but following on Joanna's messaging around the strategy related to corridors and where we want those corridors, we're getting a lot of questions about prioritization within the state's strategy. And so I think just at a super high level, we're mindful of, and you heard Joanna say it, that this is an evolution, right? And we fully expect that you're not going to have everything ironed out in year one. But when you're thinking about your strategies, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the state really has the flexibility to set its own priorities as long as it's within a balanced and thoughtful understanding of contributing to the national network. So there's no hard requirements for whether or not you start with your interstates, whether or not you do station upgrades first versus starting on new corridors, whether or not you look at specific demand modeling information. It's really up to the states to take the state priorities and figure out how to fit it into the strategy that makes sense for them. And this example came up with Nevada. So Nevada's done a ton of work implementing stations in the last few years. You can see those where the green dots are on this map. Those are the dates of when stations were installed. And so we had a conversation about whether Nevada wants to start by upgrading those existing stations because they don't currently meet the new NEVI requirements, or whether they want to go ahead and maybe move on to some of the other designated corridors within the state before coming back and upgrading those stations that were just installed. So again, it's really up to the state and just trying to balance the goals of the national network with the priorities in the state. Next slide. Lots of questions about exception requests. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that there's not going to be like a blanket approval of exception requests. There's, exception requests are around common themes of distance between the stations, distance from the highway, and power requirements. And I think what we're asking for you all, there's not going to be an exception request approved in this first year because build-out certification is not happening this first year. But what we're asking is for you to identify those areas where you have particular challenges right now. And in some cases, you're not going to know these challenges until your second or third year, and that's okay. But identify those. We want to engage with you and talk through them and explore options together, identify if there are additional resources that the Joint Office can support you in developing a solution there, or where there's not a solution that's feasible, then how we can help you build the justification so that when it comes time for the certification process, you have the documentation and the justification that you need to build that case. So again, just reach out to us as soon as you have those challenges. The more specifics you can provide, the better. And so a lot of the things that Joanna was just showing on those maps, those are the kinds of roll up our sleeves. We can, look at the maps and try to work on solutions together. And then the Joint Office actually also has some funding, particularly around power requirements, where we might be able to do some demonstration projects in some really challenging areas. But we need to have a really good sense sort of at the national level. Where are those common challenges? Where are there similar situations that people are facing so that we can focus those demonstration projects in areas that would have the greatest value to the whole nation. So next slide. So common questions, we got a lot of questions about level of detail that's needed for the state plan, full recognition that the turnaround time for doing this planning process is pretty short. So we're just asking you all to do the best that you can within the time constraints that we have. We fully understand and acknowledge that some of the components in these plans, particularly around stakeholder engagement, are things that take a lot longer time. So what we're looking for in those cases are for you to look at what you've done previously, see what you can leverage, identify the things that you've done recently, identify maybe where you have some more gaps or where you want to do additional work, and just tell us about that in the state plan. So it's okay in this plan to be sort of a plan to plan. That's totally acceptable. Then we did get some requests around whether or not it's possible to delegate the authority to other state agencies. So I think, as Mike mentioned in the beginning, historically in some of the states, the DOTs may not have been the folks that have been implementing these kinds of projects. So there's a lot of, in some cases, there's desire to have another state agency take the lead. That's totally fine as long as there's an understanding that the state DOT is ultimately responsible, since these are federal highway funds. And in some cases, the states have, in those scenarios, the states have had formal agreements that they've entered into, or it can be informal. So delegation is possible with understanding that the responsibility still lies with the DOT. questions around submitting early. Yes, it's possible to submit the plan early, but again, do the best you can to be as thorough as possible. We're not expecting, pages and pages of information, but do the best to tell us about how you're planning to spend this money. And lastly, I'll just say, this is a 5-year program, and this is the first year of this 5-year program. We're all going to be learning together. So there are some areas in the template and in the guidance where there's additional information, best practices, things like that, that we want to develop. And this first year is really an opportunity for us together to identify where those areas are, where the joint office can then go and develop some additional best practices and guidance for follow-on years. So again, first year of a 5-year program, and just give it the best shot you can. Next slide. And I think we're moving on. These are the open items. I think it's back to you, Mike.
Yes, thanks, Lisa. So I guess I got the short straw. I get to talk about all the things we don't have answers on. So consistent questions that we hear in our meetings. How will NEPA be handled? What is the exact, guidelines associated with what's eligible? Does it stop at the meter? Does it, go beyond that to, running lines to individual sites? How will equity and Justice 40 be implemented? Do we have any, best practices or any guidelines beyond what's in the program guidance? And hey, what about these 180-day minimum standards? What are they going to say? Well, unfortunately, when we're meeting with all of you, we just don't have answers that we can share on all those. And many of them, actually, all those first 4 bullets are being worked on behind the scenes. There's a group of folks in DOT, the Office of the Secretary and Federal Highway that are working on clarifying, NEPA, so that we don't know if there will be categorical exclusions, but there will be guidelines on how to address the NEVI program with NEPA. Eligible costs, equity, and the 180-day minimum standards, all of these are being worked out behind the scenes, and we would expect to have further clarifications and guidance for the states out shortly, the 180-day minimum standards by May 13th, and I think you'll see the other 2 coming out right around that time frame. Other questions that folks are asking about. It's funny, we're all focused on getting to the state plans being submitted, but then we get questions about, well, what happens after, the state plans are submitted and approved by, September 30th. So one of the questions we get from a lot of states, and this makes sense, you received your FY22 apportionment with the apportionment memo that came out in February, but folks are already thinking ahead. All right, well, if my plan is approved by September 30th and we get our FY23 funds sometime shortly thereafter, can we start using these funds too? That is an open question. We don't really have, an answer to. We also get many questions about, fully built out. What will happen? How do I get to fully built out? How do exceptions work with that? What if something happens after we're fully built out? We just had that question in the chat. Once again, these are questions we don't have official answers to, and we're trying to work out behind the scenes. Buy America is another one. This is a process that's being worked on by the highest levels of the government. You may have seen that some information came out back on April 18th, but basically that came from the White House, directed each of the agencies to then work on a waiver process for Buy America. So still TBD on that, but Department of Transportation now has the action to put together a process that folks will need to follow for NEVI. And there's language in the program guidance that talks about, it's suggested that we have all of the infrastructure built in 6 months, and we do realize with supply chain issues and other things that could potentially be impacting that 6-month suggested, that probably isn't realistic in the real world. So we do understand that there will be supply chain constraints, and we will take that into consideration. I don't think it was mentioned yet, but when the apportionment memo came out for FY22, it did talk about that these funds are available until expended. So even if there are some delays, there isn't a requirement that, once you get these funds that they have to be spent, in a certain time. Go to the next slide, please. So kind of on the coming soon, we thought we were going to be doing webinars once a week. We had our first couple, and then we've really been concentrating on the state 101s. But with this webinar, we're hoping to, relaunch the webinar series. So what we're trying to do is cover, questions kind of that was on that, previous slide. What are the issues that everyone's asking about? And maybe we haven't provided, either answers or guidance. So equity, when we have this equity guidance that we're expecting to come out shortly, we're gonna have a webinar on that that'll walk through what's in that guidance and what the states, could expect to be putting into their state plans. We've talked several times about the 180-day minimum standards and requirements. When that comes out, we'll be walking through that process. And then we also mentioned Clean Cities previously. So we are going to have a webinar that looks at the, the potential collaborations between Clean Cities and the NEVI program, focused on some of the Clean Cities efforts around the country that have been working closely with their state DOTs, whether it's working on parts of the plan, stakeholder engagement, or even some of the round 6 nominations. The last thing that I'll mention is, now that we've kind of staffed up in the joint office TA side of the house, we're thinking of having sometime this month, we'll be launching regional office hours. So this would be an opportunity to just have an open hour, hour and a half, 2 hours on our calendar for a certain day that would allow you to sign in and have access to those of us in the joint office. And what I'm hoping too is, if several states are calling in, that we facilitate a conversation. What are the issues going on in your state? Thinking about corridors that cross borders and just about anything associated with NEVI. So look for that. That'll be coming soon. Next slide, please. All right. So when we are on the State 101, and I've started this list of, you hear the same questions over and over and over. So these are the links that we're constantly throwing in the chat. I mentioned the apportionment, the FY22, the 5-year one. There's some good websites here, Federal Highway and DOE that look at bill, the equity mapping tool for Justice 40. That comes up a lot of questions about right of way and matching requirements. And when we had our State 101 with the state of Maryland a few weeks ago, they had pointed out that they have a NEVI website. So we thought that was pretty cool. So I've added that to our links. If you haven't checked that out already, please do. If you have your own NEVI website, let us know and we'll highlight you all on this slide. Next one. This will be our last slide coming up, if we can transition to it. All right. So you hate to say we're here to help, but we are here to help. And I'll quote, we're on a call with New Mexico. I guess it was last week, and we were speaking with Jerry from New Mexico DOT. And I wish I had his picture or had him able to speak, because he kept saying, hey, we're partners in this. We're partners in this. So I thought that was a great message. And that's how we have all felt, that, this is your funding, but, we are here to help. We are here to provide technical assistance. We're here to help connect the dots with the maps that Joanna showed. We're here to help you, develop your state plans, as Lisa described, with these office hours. If you aren't working with your neighbors, we hope to put you in touch. So, everything we're doing here, we all want to be working together. We all want to get to the point where you're submitting a successful plan. And then beyond that plan, we want to help you successfully implement it. So I think that is our last slide here. And I was in the chat earlier, but I got out of it for these slides. I guess I'll turn it over to either Steve or Joanna, how we want to handle the chat from this point on.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So I think Oh, we're doing that wiki thing. Okay, we're good. So I think that if you have questions that haven't been answered or questions you haven't asked yet, like now we have time to answer questions. If you have something that's been asked and we haven't answered it, please go ahead and resubmit it in the chat. There's been a lot in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer. If you have a question, a new question, we can go through and we can answer those as well. I invite all of the joint office folks to jump in, and Steve, I will ask you to be our facilitator if you would not mind.
Absolutely. So we had one come in from Lyle McMillan in Utah. Will the 180-day guidance have info about P3 contract language so the EVST does not need to revert to the state? And I think we're going to have some more information on this, but this is one of those specific topics where it's probably best for the state to engage with the joint office and the state division office at Federal Highways so that we can have a conversation about the specifics there. Anything to add from the team?
Oh, that's good. Definitely, division office needs to be looped into anything with contract.
I'm just watching the chat here. There have been a number of questions, but just trying to see. There's one here. Is a list of contacts at state DOTs for stakeholders to get involved in state working groups or state plans? The joint office does not have a specific list of state DOTs to share with stakeholders. However, organizations like AASHTO are a great resource, and we would encourage you to look at your specific state DOTs for information on outreach that they're doing, that sort of thing.
It looks like there's a question here, Steve. To what extent is the joint office working with OEMs to assess their planned investments in DC fast charging deployments across the US? Talking about Tesla's plan, and how are we planning on working together with those? Do you want to talk, Steve, a little bit about some of the conversations that you've had there?
Yeah, I don't know that I have specifics to share. However, we are engaging with all of the major OEMs through directly and kind of through some of their partner organizations just to talk about investments that they're making and how it can be leveraged. So I'm just looking at that question again.
Yeah, I think I'll jump in for a second while you're looking at the question. So one of the things that we have found is that in many cases, the OEMs are actually working directly with the state. So we had a great conversation with Utah, and they were talking about, oh, we have all of these OEMs that are actually reaching out to us right now. Rivian's reaching out to us right now. Volvo's reaching out to us. They're talking about where the stations are going. So I think this is another one of those places where there's also a partnership where the conversations are happening at the national level, at the regional level, at the state level. And so making sure that information is flowing back and forth as much as we can. Is one of the things we're trying to do. I do know that in the legislation, there is a requirement for the alternative fuel station locator on the AFDC, where there is a way to actually see where stations are planned or where folks are thinking about putting stations in sooner, so that we don't run into the situation where we're trying to build on top of multiple stations. And so that's something that we've got a request for funding in to try to figure out how do we do that. We know that there are some challenges with that. For example, you don't want to too early in the process say, oh, we're going to put a station here, because what we've seen in the past is that as soon as you say, oh, I want to put a station here, the people who own that property say, someone wants to put a station there, we should make sure we make as much money as possible off of that. So trying to make sure that we are allowing the market forces to work as they're supposed to, while also making sure that we have the information available so we don't duplicate efforts, is one of the challenges we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, and there was another element to that question. It said NEVI is a great step forward, but $5 billion in federal assistance will likely be insufficient on its own in achieving DCFC ubiquity. And I think that's a good point. I mean, this is an investment, a sizable investment, and it'll go supporting sort of the backbone of a national network. And it kind of speaks to that big tent idea. There's lots of investment, and this is hopefully just a piece of the puzzle when it comes to creating an opportunity for everyone to ride and drive electric in the future. And then,
Steve, sorry, I know I just noticed a lot of questions around power and the maybe lack of three-phase power or ability to have the 600 kW. I think that, again, we want to understand where those specific challenges are. So that's an opportunity to engage with the joint office, show us on a map, let us know what, the conversation that's happened with the utility, help us understand what those real challenges are in those specific locations. We might be able to help with some additional thoughts or opportunities there. And then if not, again, we're building the case so that when it comes time for the full build out certification, we can help support that request for an exception. So there's not a specific, yes, all rural situations are going to be exempted from the power requirements, but we want to understand where those challenges are and what the specific nature of those challenges is. So just trying to tackle several of those comments all at once there.
I think I have two that we can knock out here. So the first was, does the TA team have any recommendations for how to treat Teslas when modeling projecting demand on corridors? So I think this may kind of speak to the question of whether or not you as a state may want to surpass the minimum requirements in certain locations and build out beyond that minimum 4-port 150 kilowatt station design. And that's something we can certainly help with. We can look at traffic demand models and kind of help you think through where it may make sense to do that. But it's something that we'll have to kind of engage specifically on. So I would encourage you to submit that question to the joint office email address on this slide. And then the other one was, do all alternative fuel vehicle designated corridors have to be completely built out or just under contract before we can begin on other locations? So this is kind of still evolving, and I think this is one of the things that we discussed might be coming more. But we understand that procuring a station and actually having the station operational are potentially two different things with different timelines. So I think there'll be more to come on this. Anything to add there from the team? Let's see, there was another one here about 2 alternative fuel corridors coming together at a place that would be NEVI compliant for both routes. Can we overlap and get credit for both corridors? It's a great question for Joanna.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, so I think strategically, that's what we would like to see, right? Is if there's a place where you could put one station in and have multiple routes actually being able to service those corridors, I think that's a great site. And I think that's the type of thing also where, the Florida example that I gave, where if you're driving one way and it's 2 miles off the highway, but the other way it's 1 mile off the highway, but it's servicing both of those sets of corridors. Something worth noting and letting us know about. It's also an opportunity, like Steve was saying, to think about whether or not that's a location that maybe you either want to future-proof or go above and beyond the NEVI requirements. If it's a really heavily set of roadways, is there something you want to do there to make sure that when those routes are being traveled and you're getting, the traffic from both directions, that you're able to meet the needs of those drivers. But yeah, if I was planning, I would definitely be looking for locations like that. Make the most out of those opportunities to be able to provide, a nice charging location that is going to have more traffic coming through, thus making it more attractive for people to provide amenities to those vehicles. I think that sounds like a great strategy.
Just add a little on that, Joanna, because the question talks about 2 U.S. highways being considered for corridor nominations, I'm assuming for round 6. So while the round 6 request for nominations in NEVI talks about the priority being for interstates, if you have a couple of U.S. highways that you consider a priority in your state, and you would like to nominate them to have immediate access to the NEVI funding, because the NEVI funding can only be used on designated corridors. So if these 2 U.S. highways are a priority in your state, a corridor you're looking for immediate access to NEVI funding, then yes, it makes sense to go ahead and
And Mike, you sound like evil Bizarro Mike again for some reason.
Oh,
This is
I'm
all
sorry.
electric. That's okay. Just so you know.
Okay, I won't talk.
Well, you can talk. Just know that you sound like a supervillain.
So here's another question. Does the joint office have an idea on how much the distribution system can handle a 3-phase 600 kilowatt power supply without major upgrades? So we are working closely with our utility partners, and state DOTs are also engaging utilities early in the process. And this is really a location-specific question. And so there will be analysis conducted in partnership with utilities and state DOTs and the site host to kind of understand what the opportunities and limitations are there. So yes, in some areas there will need to be upgrades. In other areas, there may not need to be as significant of an upgrade. How about this one here? When will alternative fuel corridor round 6 be approved? What is the
Mike-
timeline for that?
Mike or Diane?
Yeah, hey, this is Diane. I don't know an exact timeline. They're due May 13th, right? So we're going to do them as quickly as possible, but it really is dependent on how many quarter nominations we receive. If we receive, 25 states, might be a couple weeks. If we receive all 50 states, it may be into, the end of June or July, but we will promise to do them as quickly as possible.
So Steve, I was going back in time a little bit and looking at some questions that I don't think we've quite answered yet. There was a question here regarding the 4 CCS ports capable of simultaneously charging vehicles. Can we have 2 chargers in 2 distinct locations, but within a certain distance meet this requirement? So I think that's a question that we've gotten quite a bit, and they've been more hypothetical questions, sort of like this one is. And what we've been encouraging states to do is if you do have a location where this is actually the situation that you have where you're looking and you're like, oh, I mean, I don't have a NEVI compliant station here, but I have this one on this side of the highway and this one on this side of the highway, and this has 2 chargers and this has 2 chargers, and they each have 2 CCS ports and it can do 150 kilowatts. Please identify those for us if that's a location that you would like to have considered so that we can take it through our process and think about it. I can understand the attractiveness of that and the advantage of that. But when we're dealing in hypotheticals, the answer tends to be no, because it's a hypothetical. And when we can look at an actual situation and understand how that might benefit the roadway, we might be able to think about that differently. So I would encourage you, if you do have those types of situations, it's on our very long list of proactive analyses that we would like to do, is to actually take a look at the data we have ourselves and understand where those situations might actually exist. I think in city centers, especially, you're going to see a ton of that, right? There's a bunch of stations that are all in a location, but whether that's strategic or not, and that actually leads to a corridor type of a situation is something that we'll want to think about. So I encourage you to send those to the joint office, include them in your state plans, if there's a scenario where that actually exists.
There was a question with some specifics in it, but generally related to Tesla opening up their charging network to non-Tesla owners. And of course, if some of those Tesla stations were now accessible to all drivers via CCS, then that could change the calculus in terms of which corridors are fully built out. So that's something that we're tracking and continuing to look into.
Yep. I think there's another question I'm looking at about built out status be rescinded if a compliant charger location is shut down and the 50-mile threshold no longer holds. I think that's another great example of those sort of hypothetical questions that we've been thinking about, that part of why we want to have the access to the historic station data that I mentioned earlier is so that we can actually start to do some analyses to say, okay, how often does that happen? Where does it happen? What have we seen in the past? And do some analyses around how we would actually handle those types of situations, right? Again, in a metropolitan area where a station would get shut down for some reason or other, but there's a large density of stations around that might not have too much of an impact on a corridor. But if you're talking about where you have a location that's actually bridging that 50 miles and you lose that particular station, what happens there? I think that'll be something that the joint office wants to think about, figure out how do we support that? How do we find out about that ahead of time? How do we know when those stations are being challenged and what might happen? So I think it's a great scenario. It's something that we're interested in when we talk about the resiliency of these corridors. But it's something that's one of those future ideas that we don't necessarily have an answer around right now. We're aware that that's a challenge and it's something that states are asking about, and it's something we want to understand better.
So we had a question come in. Does the joint office have a document of all the questions asked and answered from the state meetings? Yes, we do. We track all of the questions that are asked, and we have many that come in to the joint office via email and our Dun service. And so today's webinar is an attempt to kind of offer up some of the common themes that have emerged from those. And as Diane mentioned in the chat, we do hope to be able to issue some approved written FAQs here shortly as well. And then another question, can we discuss Tesla opening their station in our plan, or is that still too much of a hypothetical question? You could certainly discuss it in your plan and how that could factor into maybe how you expect to prioritize investment. But of course, relative to fully built out status, a determination will have to be made as to whether or not stations that exist that do meet the minimum requirements. So yeah, certainly something you could discuss, but maybe just kind of consider how that might impact your strategy.
Again, I'm looking back a little bit. There's a question about what use station economic viability, demographic, and traffic flow considerations were used when the 50-mile requirements was selected. That's a great question, Jesse. And I will say that requirement has been revisited every single year of the Alternative Fuel Corridor program. It's been vetted by our partners. It's been vetted by OEMs. It's been vetted by stations station networks, and talking about what does that actually look like. We've done some detailed deep dive analyses into that. And prior to NEVI passing, there was a lot of discussion around that 50-mile requirement. So it's not a requirement that we've come by lightly. It's not a requirement that hasn't been reevaluated time and time again. Happy to talk specifics with you if you want to get into the nitty-gritties, but know that that is a decision that has had a lot of eyes on it and continues to hold true at that 50-mile requirement.
There's a question here. Once the alternative fuel corridor is built out, will states be able to use NEVI funds to build charging at a reduced state along corridors within the plan, but outside the alternative fuel corridors? So the 90-day guidance does discuss this specifically and says that there may be additional flexibility in terms of station design and location once you achieve fully built out status.
All right. Are we slowing down?
There are just some general questions about really that relate to cost eligibility. And so we will have more to share on cost eligibility coming up here in the next couple of weeks.
And I would say that is one of those places where the state meetings have been so valuable, and understanding the details of where the states are looking for eligible costs, why they're looking for eligible costs. It's been really useful for us to be able to have that information and feed that into the joint office. So thank you again for your candor on those and for the specific examples you provided, because that's been really valuable in helping to shape that program.
And then maybe a quick question here on what can be considered as a state match. So go ahead, Joanna.
Oh, Mike grabbed that one, I think.
Okay.
If I don't sound like a robot anymore, yes.
You don't sound like a robot anymore.
Okay. Yeah, it's either eligible for federal funding or match. Like it's one, they're both the same. So it's when that cost eligibility document comes out, then that ought to provide more answers and more details.
All right, and I think we are at time now. So we definitely appreciate all of the questions. And if we didn't get to you, please do submit your question to that email address that you see on the screen now, doe-dot.jo.ta@nrel.gov, and we will get back to you. But we really appreciate everyone's time today. So thank you so much for joining us, and please do stay engaged.